Okay, I think we need to go now. Otherwise, it's going to take the whole morning, and we just have 1 hour in front of us. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Maria Aldanas. I'm policy officer at FEANTSA. I coordinate the Housing Rights Watch network, which is a network of associations, lawyers, academics from different countries, and we are all committed to promoting the right to housing. This network was created by FEANTSA, and it's currently running thanks to the support of Abbe Pierre Foundation. I'm going to post in the chat some of the resources that we have done over the years, so that you know more or less what I'm talking about. So this book that we are introducing today is not the first resource that we have created over the years. I am happy to present this joint publication coordinated by Pori Kenna and Noria Derdek today. Thanks to both for their hard work. I would have never imagined the amount of work that goes into such a publication. The book is now available on our website, and if you haven't seen it, you can go to the following link that I'm going to paste in the chat. So I'm not going to take that much more time to talk myself. I would like just to remind you that this publication is a continuation of the European Contribution to the Right to Housing, a conference that we held back in Brussels in May 2022. So that's 1 year ago. And here to explain what's in the book, we have Professor Pori Kenna, who is co-coordinator of this publication. He is the director of the Center for Housing Law, Rights and Policy at the School of Law at University of Galway, Ireland. And he has specialized in housing law and housing rights, property and land law, consumer law, regulations and governance. He, apart from being a member of different advisory bodies, he's coordinator of the Housing Law Working Group of the European Network of Housing Researchers, and he established with others the FEANTSA Expert Group on Housing Rights and Housing Rights Watch. Thanks, Barry, for being here, and please take the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Maria. Can you all hear me okay? Nod, please. Yeah, okay. So I want to welcome everybody to the launch of this new publication, the European and International Contribution to the Right to Housing, Standards, Litigation and Advocacy. So it's quite a big book, as you can see. I also would like to welcome our distinguished speakers, Kim van Sparentek, Member of the European Parliament, Professor Aoife Nolan, President of the European Committee of Social Rights. We're very honored to have your participation here today. So, like all good works, this book is a creation of many people working together, bringing and sharing their knowledge and their expertise in a very generous and open way. As Maria has pointed out, the book emerged from a conference in May 2022, organized by Maria herself, through Housing Rights Watch and Foundation Abbe Pierre in Brussels, the first really big meeting on housing rights after COVID. And this opening up, if you like, generated a flowering of debate. Many new synergies were formed. New ways of looking at old problems were discussed. One of these important developments was the link between climate change activism and housing rights advocacy. And we also began to recognize that the right to housing must now include a new element, sustainability, both for the housing itself and indeed for the planet. We also now know that 3/4 of housing in the EU is not energy efficient, and that significant measures are needed to address that situation. But we noticed something else. Climate change advocacy, with its broad objectives and support of social movements, provides new inspiration for housing rights advocates on how to approach the whole development of rights and how to use strategic litigation. So this book then brings together for the first time judges, academics, policymakers, housing rights advocates, and others, all focused on the question of defining the state of the right to housing in Europe and how it can be advanced. Of course, we know that there are some 700,000 people who are homeless across the EU as a whole. And we hear regular reports of homeless people dying on streets of Brussels, capital of the EU. So there's no room for complacency in this debate. At the same time, all European states have adopted housing rights obligations through the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, European Social Charter and Revised Charter. The EU Charter of Fundamental Rights even recognizes at Article 7 the right to home as a fundamental right, and also the right to social and housing assistance to secure a decent existence. We also have the European Pillar of Social Rights to inform EU policy making. We have all states have ratified the European Convention on Human Rights, which provides protection against interference with the right with home. And of course, we have that wonderful resolution of the European Parliament in 2021 on access to decent and affordable housing for all, and with the commitment to end homelessness by 2030, for which we can thank Kim van Sparentek a great deal. So we are not short of housing rights texts, instruments, or indeed aspirations in Europe. So that makes us ask the question, why is there then so much homelessness and housing need? And so really that is the context where we approached this book, to look at all of these aspects and see if we can bring something coherent. As we all know, standards which appear with great clarity in legal texts can deflate rapidly when challenged as legally enforceable norms, especially in housing systems with many powerful stakeholders and interests. Equally, we see that individual advocacy, which are very valuable to protecting individuals' personal rights, may not translate into any system-wide change. We also notice that the legal treatment of housing as property can impact on the decision of courts, as judges are often bound to protect constitutional property rights as a first priority. So that's some of the context. And so to the work of the writers who gave so generously of their time to present at Brussels and to prepare these detailed drafts and redrafts and revisions which we imposed on them over the past 4 months. The book begins with a valuable examination of the question of EU competences, whether exclusive, shared, or supportive of member states. And of course, depending on which of these competences is being exercised, the application of housing rights can vary. As Judge Rossi of the Court of Justice points out in Chapter 1, the Court of Justice can only apply the Charter, the EU Charter that is, where there is an EU law nexus, as set out in the treaties. The Charter operates in the shadow of EU law, but is an important interpretative standard, however, used by the court for assessing the application of EU secondary legislation, which sometimes involves housing-related rights. And she outlines those cases in her chapter. In Chapter 2, Professor Albuquerque suggests that judges of the European Court of Human Rights have become more cautious in defining socioeconomic rights in recent years. This theme of defining housing rights by human rights adjudication bodies is developed by Professor Palmisano, former president of the European Committee of Social Rights, where he emphasizes the advantage of a collective complaint system, a collective approach. And he also outlines the comprehensive nature in which state obligations are defined by the European Committee on Social Rights. Part 3 then focuses on the lessons for housing rights advocacy, which can be learned from strategic litigation on climate change. In this context, Delphine Missone and Marine Izquierdo suggest climate action lawsuits taken by civil society groups are actually a means of whistleblowing, of defending, of criticizing, and of fighting for the recognition of rights. This dynamic legal, political, and social energy, which characterizes climate change litigation, can provide inspiration for housing rights advocacy. Indeed, this theme is developed by Nicola Bernard and Caldo Casla in Chapter 5, who provide a valuable analysis of the differences and similarities between strategic human rights litigation on the climate crisis and on housing rights, respectively. Climate and housing related issues impact most negatively on the same type of people, the poorest members of society. So there is a common bond here. Part 3 provides a focus on how the principle of proportionality as it relates to evictions from home is being developed. Here, Maria and myself trace the genesis of Article 8 ECHR and its proportionality in housing evictions, but also its limitations, the fact that it's not applicable horizontally. However, we do see some expansion of its reach in the Court of Justice in relation to Article 7 of the EU Charter, but particularly at the UN Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, under the optional protocol of the International Covenant. Lots of new precedents being created there. In Part 4, Max Althoff provides a detailed examination of rent controls in Germany, widely seen as providing the most equitable model in Europe. Virginie Toussaint challenges the dichotomy between EU regulations on state aid and social housing, with the need to support the provision of social housing for a wide section of the population. And she presents the European Pillar of Social Rights as one potential means of creating coherence in this area. This dichotomy between human rights and liberal market ideals and the reality is again highlighted in the chapter by Noria Derdek and Mark Urey. They point to the extensive network of legal protection, systematic and curative policies, which are intended to guarantee on paper at any rate, and even at great expense, minimum housing standards. However, when the system is in fact largely controlled by private financial interests, the role and action of the state and courts in monitoring how public policies are meeting housing rights standards becomes critical. Part 5 examines the key questions of energy poverty. Marlies Hesselman links the EU Electricity Directive with the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights and the European Pillar of Social Rights, as well as the key concepts of adequacy, affordability, and habitability, which are set out in international housing rights. Louise Sunderland examines mandatory energy standards for homes in a number of countries and regions, focusing on England, where she highlights the difficulties of enforcing legally binding minimum energy standards unless available resources are provided. Of course, in all of this, we see there are many who say that the EU has no competence or a tiny competence in housing anyway, and that this is really only a matter for member states. Of course, we know the EU does not directly build, rent, or sell housing, or even provide insulation in housing, although it might create the policies and provide some of the funding for that, but it does have an enormous impact. Many decisions taken at EU level impact directly on housing and homelessness at local level. In fact, over the years, I have often heard the argument in environmental cases or challenges that we must take this case to Europe. It's a very common refrain in Irish courts. We must take this case to Europe. But actually, what we need to realize is that we are all already in Europe. We are in Europe. It is not out there somewhere. It is actually here. It's in every local court. It's in every homeless shelter in all the 27 member states. So Europe is not out there. Europe is here. And of course, many decisions and rules taken by the EU can impact immediately and directly on housing at local level. We see this in lots of rules which have been created over the years, some of which residualize social housing. We see the impact of freedom of movement of capital and workers and of asylum policies. We see EU rules on planning and environmental protection, interest rates on housing loans, for instance. And also we see a certain obsession by some of the EU institutions with treating housing as an asset as opposed to a human right. This book then concludes with the deeply insightful analysis by Carole Nivard from University of Rouen in France, which draws together all these strands. She points out, however, that the right to housing is ultimately a question of social justice. What is at stake is the right of every person to live with dignity among other human beings, and beyond that, the right of humanity to inhabit our planet in a sustainable manner in the future. And finally, I want to particularly thank my fellow author, Nuria, who has worked tirelessly on getting this book to publication over the past 4 months. And indeed worked at weekends, evenings, and late into the night. And I have seen her emails coming at lots of times when most people had stopped working. And I also want to say she has actually provided the inspiration for this book. So thank you all for attending, and thank you very much, Nuria.
Thank you, Porrick. I am now going to give the floor for highlighting the relevance of the topic at European level. We have invited Kim von Sparentak, a well-known figure in Brussels. She is an MEP with the group of the Greens, European Free Alliance, and she was the rapporteur for the report on access to decent and affordable housing for all. Most recently, and probably less known, is the publication of her draft report on the short-term rental regulation. I see that her priority here for the upcoming negotiations is to make sure that local authorities are able to enforce rules on platforms like Airbnb to ensure affordable housing and livable cities. We thank her for her commitment to the cause and for being here. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and thank you for inviting me during this webinar, Patrick. Congratulations! It sounds really exciting. I hope I could also get a copy. Also happy to pay for it, of course, but I'm very interested. Maybe let's just dive into it, because you know, why are we busy with talking about housing at a European level? It is because, you know, no matter where we are, whether you're speaking with people from Warsaw, Athens, Dublin, or Lisbon, we see that more and more people cannot afford a decent home anymore. And with the soaring cost of living crisis and high inflation rates, a lot of attention has been paid recently to countries where the housing prices have dropped, like Sweden. The picture is more mixed than before, but overall, housing prices actually have kept on rising. House prices are up by 2.9% in the euro area and by 3.6% in the European Union in the fourth quarter of 2022, compared with the same quarter of 2021. And in some countries and sectors, wages have been adapted to inflation. A lot of other people are still suffering the results from the pandemic and have seen their income drop. And in particular, people on flexible and precarious contracts have suffered. And for them, owning their own house is just a utopian idea. But meanwhile, rents also keep on steadily rising. And in the fourth quarter of 2022, rents were 2.5% higher than the year before. And this is, of course, lower than the inflation rate, but people are spending more of their income on food and energy, which puts renters into trouble. The cost of living crisis has put the already existing housing crisis on edge. And housing is a human right, guaranteed internationally at the EU level and lots of countries in the Constitution. And this should be the starting point of our housing policies, because houses are for people, not for unlimited profit. And it's therefore timely to discuss the right to housing and how to bring this into practice. And I believe the publication that's presented today shows that the right to housing is something that needs to be actively fought for. And I also really want to thank Housing Rights Watch and everyone working on this publication for their important work. The rules of the market right now prevail. Austerity policies led to severe cut in investments in social housing, and governments are confronted with financial investors active in their housing markets, or in some cases have actively encouraged them. And more money flows into housing, and less people can actually afford a home. So clearly something isn't right. and it's often the younger generations that are paying the price. And the housing crisis manifested itself in the first place in large cities. In cities like Lisbon, entire neighborhoods turned into ghost towns in the pandemic because tourists didn't come anymore. And this shows how much housing was actually used to accommodate tourists instead of providing a home for people to live in or to work or study in the city. More and more, however, we're confronted with evidence that the housing crisis isn't just an urban phenomenon. The roaring and often hidden poverty in rural areas and the growing pressure from richer people buying secondary homes there, also as a result from the pandemic, are making the housing crisis spread across the territories. And besides the lack of access because of housing shortages and affordability issues, also the quality of a lot of houses is poor. A lot of people live in dwellings that are simply too small for their families. This has severe effects on issues like domestic violence and equal education opportunities. And damp houses with poor insulation have severe impacts on health, particularly for children. And moreover, the last year has shown that people can't afford to heat their homes in winter or cool them in summer. And part of the reduction in gas consumption is simply the result of people heating their homes barely or not at all. At the beginning of 2021, the European Parliament adopted the report on decent and affordable housing for all, for which I was the rapporteur. And what is the core is that housing is put as a human right. The report also recognizes that the EU has been too absent when it comes to housing, and whilst the EU will not build homes, I don't think that a bureaucrat in Brussels knows what kind of house should be built. But a lot of EU policies have a major impact on housing. And I really hope this can be a start of a shift of minds at the European level. And since the adoption of the report, some really important steps have been taken. In June 2021, all member states adopted the Declaration on Homelessness, embracing the target to end homelessness by 2030. The European Platform on Combating Homelessness has adopted its work plan, and progress when it comes to data collection and better access to EU funding is underway. We can't ignore, however, that the target seems further away than ever. We see that the number of evictions has been on the rise in several member states. And the European Parliament is also following up on the housing report. In our resolution adopted this month ahead of the Porto Summit, we call for EU support for the European Platform on Combating Homelessness in order to deliver on its ambitions and targets as written into the Lisbon Declaration. And what we also noticed was that housing became more prominent on the European agenda. We had a meeting of the housing ministers under the French presidency, and housing affordability was discussed by the Eurogroup. And one of the most important and broad calls of the report was for a coordinated approach to affordable and social housing at the EU level. And the initiatives of the Commission on Principle 19 of the Pillar of Social Rights have been limited to one of the three elements, homelessness. And I want to underline that more can be done here, but regarding access to social housing and protection against eviction, nothing has been done. In the same resolution, the Parliament urges the Commission to develop an ambitious action plan in line with the principle of subsidiarity to achieve accessible, green and affordable social housing to meet the housing needs of all EU citizens and to eradicate homelessness by 2030. An area where we did see actions are rules for data sharing by short-term rental platforms. The expansive growth of short-term accommodation rental has led to extracting housing for inhabitants from the market, driving up housing prices, and has also impacted the livability of neighborhoods. There's an increasing professionalization in the sector, and short-term rentals are an important contributing factor in the financialization of the housing market. And I worked really hard to ensure that the Commission would listen to the call of the European Parliament in the housing report and of the biggest cities in Europe to make sure that cities have the necessary data to enforce the local rules. I'm very positive about the proposal of the Commission. As a rapporteur, my priority is now to make sure that authorities will be able to better enforce local rules on short-term rentals in order to ensure affordable housing. We need to make sure that the data exchanges work in practice, that effective action can be undertaken against illegal listings. One area where the EU's rules have in particularly had actual and adverse impact in achieving Pillar 19 of the European Pillar of Social Rights is the financialization of the housing market. A study commissioned by the Greens highlighted that in the last decade in Berlin, 40 billion euro was invested by institutional investors. Blackstones and other private equity funds are some of the companies heavily involved, but they are just the face of a complex web of banks, pension funds, insurance companies, and sovereign wealth. We need transparency on who owns our cities. At national level, registers on real estate transactions and beneficial ownership need to be set up, and these need to be connected at EU level. At local or national level, taxes on vacancy and an obligation for owners to live in the house they own should be considered. And we should revise the rules of the Capital Markets Union, since they have resulted in deregulation and lowering the risk for investment in housing. Since the financial crisis, there's an average annual investment gap in affordable and social housing of 57 billion euros per year. And we need to urgently close this gap. Member states need to invest more in the public, social housing and cooperative housing sector. And it's positive to see that some countries are using the recovery fund for it, but the EU can help in other ways. We see that the current fiscal rules are putting limits on how much governments can actually invest in housing. The revision of the Stability and Growth Pact needs to ensure that there is room for social investment, such as in housing. And with the European semester, we also have a powerful tool to steer economic and social policies, such as housing, by the Commission. Has been recommending for years to shrink the Dutch social housing sector because it endangers the private rental sector. Finally, we need to make sure that the EU investment through InvestEU, the EIB, and structural funds are based on expertise and evidence and make them more accessible. And therefore, I propose to set up a housing high-level expert group, mirroring the one existing on sustainable finance. I think the final major challenge I would like to address is the issue of renovation and energy poverty. It is estimated that up to 125 million people in Europe live in energy poverty, and this is likely worsened with the energy crisis. And this has been a massive incentive to make homes more energy efficient. We risk deepening the existing social divide, where only those that can actually afford it benefit from lower energy bills. And therefore, I fully support also the call of the Right to Energy Coalition for energy efficiency for all. The EU can really make a big difference in housing renovation. We know massively investing in housing renovation is good for the climate, jobs, and health, but it can also get people out of energy poverty and into decent homes by focusing efforts on social housing and on the least energy efficient houses. Decisive action is needed to cushion the impact of including the built environment into the emission trading scheme, and the social climate fund alone is not enough. My Green colleague Karen Kaff has worked hard to include social safeguards in the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive, and also more supportive policies will be needed. Let's, however, not give up on the dream of an energy efficient home for all and lower the ambitions in this regard. Let's shift the conversation towards more solidarity, redistribution, and taxing pollution and wealth to make sure the Green Deal doesn't only leaves no one behind, but actually improves everyone's quality of life. And while this is a positive ambition for the future, we need to also deal with the urgent crisis we're still facing. And I've been calling for a ban on energy disconnection since last fall. And we've seen that several member states took action, but the Commission didn't go further than supporting voluntary commitments from the energy sector. And if we don't want to lose the support of citizens, the action on this topic should level up to what we did to save the banks in the financial crisis. Currently, we're working on the gas directive and the electricity market reform, and to include better consumer protection and the ban on energy disconnections in them, we are working very hard. We should, however, not forget that those will enter into force in some years. In the meanwhile, we should actually take emergency measures. From supporting the construction of more social housing, fighting speculation, addressing homelessness, and achieving energy efficiency for all, there is a lot that the EU can do to achieve access to decent and affordable housing for all. And I will keep fighting for more action from the EU, and your hard work in your member states help me with that. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kim. Can I call you Kim? Sorry.
Of course you can.
I struggle to say Madame von Sparretak.
I struggle to hear it. It's okay.
Okay, that's good. Thank you so much. This is thank you for being here. Like, really, I know that how busy you are, and yeah, like the fact that you can take some time to be here with us, it's really amazing for us. So thank you for your commitment. Thanks. So next we are going to have Madam, no. Eva Nolan, Professor Eva Nolan. She's also well known by our audience. Some of our audience is housing rights researchers, academics. She's professor of international human rights law and co-director of the Human Rights Law Center at the University of Nottingham. She's president of the Council of Europe's European Committee of Social Rights, which she joined in 2017. And as you know, she has published extensively in the areas of human rights and constitutional law, particularly in relation to economic and social rights. She's also an academic expert member at Doughty Street Chambers, where she co-leads the Children's Right Group. Thank you very much for being here, Aoife, and the floor is yours.
Pleasure. Thank you so much, Maria Jose, and thank you to Porrig and to Noria. I'm delighted to speak at the launch of this book. And of course, my first happy task is to congratulate the directors of the project, Noria Derdek and Porrig Kenna. And of course, the excellent contributors, many of whom I can see from the chat are with us today. And of course, yourself, Maria Jose, without whom the conference in which this publication originated would not have taken place. And I have to say the book is a considerable achievement. Congratulations to you all. Now, I'm going to make 3 points in my comments. So I promise that they will be mercifully brief. First of all, I want to flag that this book emerges from an important partnership between advocacy and academia focused on the right to housing. On the one hand, we have FEANTSA, the Housing Rights Watch Network, and Fondation Abbe Pierre, all of whom do vital legal and policy work from an advocacy perspective focused on housing rights in Europe. And on the other hand, we have the University of Galway, rightly celebrated for its hugely impactful academic work on housing rights, led by Porrig Kenna. And I stress this because looking at the history of housing rights, it is both unsurprising and fitting that today we should be celebrating the outcome of such a partnership, because partnerships between advocacy and academia have played a vital role in the development, the deepening, and the advancement of the right to housing globally since the late 1990s. And if you'll allow me to play the appalling personal anecdote card for a moment, my own first real human rights job while a PhD student was in 2002 with the Geneva-based Centre on Housing Rights and Evictions, which was possibly the first international NGO to focus specifically on the right to adequate housing in the sense of international human rights law. And at that time, okay, so 20 years ago, in the field of human rights, we saw significant and increasing collaboration between advocacy and academia in the forms of research, strategic litigation emerging from university clinics focused on housing, proposals for policy and legal reform that emerged directly from collaboration between housing rights advocates and academics. Partnerships were important then, and as we can see from today's event, they are important now. And this book makes it very, very clear. So hooray for partnerships and hooray for the book. Second, in the last 20 years, there has undoubtedly been a huge increase in the profile of and the work around the right to adequate housing and housing rights internationally, regionally, and domestically. And I thought Kim's presentation was very interesting on that, as was Porrig, of course, in his overview of the book. Now, of course, an awful lot of time and attention has been rightly devoted to jurisprudence and to work from jurisdictions such as South Africa, where you have strong constitutional protection of housing rights, which have resulted in wide-ranging case law and large bodies of litigation in this area. Okay. However, looking back over the last 20 years, even in countries where there has historically been far less enthusiasm for the notion of legally enforceable housing rights, the language of the right to housing and housing rights has come center stage in advocacy and politics and the media due to increasing societal concerns about the appalling inequality we see in terms of access to decent housing in the last 15 years. And Ireland, which is my own country, is an excellent example of where this has occurred. There has been a real shift in the discourse, both social, but also in the media and indeed amongst politicians. And we have overall, and again, I'm echoing what Kim said in her talk, we have seen an attitudinal shift in many parts of Europe resulting from the pressures and the situations created by the financial and economic crisis of the 2000s, their austerity-dominated aftermath, then the COVID crisis where home and location in the home was so important, and now the cost, of course, the cost of living crisis, which we are experiencing at the moment. And of course, the centrality of adequate housing and housing rights to public discourse is only set to increase with the climate crisis, a crisis that is rightly given proper attention in this book. And I think it's fair to say that 2023 is the high watermark in terms of public and political awareness of the issue of housing and housing rights in Europe. And this book and the ideas in it crucially make clear what many of the key challenges are in terms of securing enjoyment of housing rights, both in the here and now and in future. And even more crucially, it proposes clear solutions to those challenges. I will finish in a minute. I was invited to speak today, not because of my fascinating, background story of having had a job in housing rights, but because I am current president of the European Committee of Social Rights. Now, the committee has a very significant body of case law on the right to adequate housing in terms of the European Social Charter, both under Articles 31 and 16 of the Charter. Okay, and you can find that work in our digest. Now, this work, bluntly, does not receive the attention it deserves, particularly from academics. And the problem with this isn't so much that, it's lower, it's not so, this isn't an ego trip issue. The problem with this situation is that the potential of the Charter, the potential of the reporting and the collective complaint system isn't being harnessed to the degree that it could and that it should be to support domestic efforts to strengthen housing rights protections at the national level. And while the literature around the committee's work, both in the area of housing and more generally, is increasing, this book is absolutely an important addition. And I just want to make 3 points that struck me as I read the contributions in it. First, there is a long-standing jurisprudence under the European Social Charter with regard to the environment, including its connection to housing, that is not currently being leveraged by those working in the climate justice space to the extent that it could and it should be, given the challenges currently faced in Europe and the opportunities afforded by the Charter system to engage with those problems. Second, with regard to proportionality, which is addressed in several of the contributions to this book, it would be good to see more attention paid to the committee's work in this area. And it may well be that the forthcoming merits decision in complaint number 1852019, European Roma Rights Centre in Belgium, which will be made public in a few months, will provide an opportunity for taking a look and for engaging with the committee's work around proportionality in the context of housing rights. Now, my final point relates to the committee's forthcoming work. In 2024, we will be implementing our new reporting system. And this will involve our producing for the first time a new kind of report, a so-called ad hoc report, and this ad hoc report will be focused on the cost of living crisis. And obviously, you will be unsurprised to hear that housing and energy poverty related issues are of key concern in this context. And I would welcome people and I would encourage people and organizations working on these areas to engage with the ad hoc report process and to submit information to the committee once the call is out. Your committee needs you if it is to engage meaningfully with the challenges posed with regards to housing and energy poverty in the current cost of living crisis. I leave it there. Again, huge congratulations to everyone involved in this impressive book, and thank you so much for the opportunity to speak to all of you today and to engage in this celebration around that great work.
Thank you, Aoife. Thank you, Aoife. I'm still a bit shocked about this new ad hoc reporting that she just announced. And she can be sure that from FEANTSA, Housing Rights Watch, and I'm sure from my colleagues in Abbe Pierre Foundation, we're going to do everything in our hand to participate or to encourage people to participate in the reporting, this new kind of report focusing on the cost of living crisis. Thank you for all the participation, all the really interesting information that you provided, Aoife. Now we're gonna be concluding. We're gonna have a few concluding observations from Noria Derdek. She is a lawyer. She's a member of the legal team of Abbe Pierre Foundation, and she's a passionate activist for the rights of vulnerable people and the alma mater and co-coordinator of the book. Noria's mother tongue is French, and she's going to do a big effort to talk to us today in English. So bear with us. But if you have any questions, I will be happy to answer them afterwards. Okay. Noria, tu peux parler maintenant?
Yes, thank you. And first of all, huge thank you to the authors of the contribution to make this book. Special thanks to Padre Kenna and Maria Jose Aldanas, without whom this publication would not have been possible, even less in bilingual version. Thank you very much also to Kim and Aoife for your presence here today, which makes it possible to link legal awareness and with political awareness. As Padre said, the right to housing does exist, either directly or through the interdependence of rights, because it is necessary to physical and mental health, education, private and family life, etc. It has also been emphasized that rights are not only theoretical. With this publication, we explore the foundation of housing legislation and policies. In order to move from theory to practice, we reach the conclusions that it is necessary to pursue much further the path already started of consensus building in Europe around the right to housing, and that the meaning and objectives of legislation and policies converge towards the same goal, both at the European level, institutional, and between countries in their reserved fields of action. A point of attention before continuing: what does housing mean in our publication? We refer to the general observation of the UN, number 4 on the right to adequate housing, and number 7 on eviction mainly, as we as to the decision of the ECSR, starting with FEANTSA and adjudicators with versus France. Thus, housing legislation and policy, whether national or European, should aim to comply with 7 key factors: affordability, security of tenure, availability of facilities and infrastructure, habitability, accessibility, location and cultural appropriateness. Today, we all make the same observation, which has been expressed by the European reports carried out by FEANTSA and the Foundation and Abbe Pierre of the last 8 years. Poor housing is on the rise in all European countries, and the consequences of it are disastrous for human dignity. However, these texts require us to set objectives and precise monitoring indicators on the progress to be achieved. The states must commit themselves to the objectives and indicators so that the right to adequate housing becomes a reality for each inhabitant of the Union. This leads us to recognize that the situation will not be resolved by itself, and especially for the disadvantaged. And by this, we do not mean only to so-called vulnerable or most vulnerable. Poor housing is intolerable for all: men, women, children, whether alone or with their families. The criteria of vulnerability exists only to evaluate the level of responsibility in regard to infringement to the rule of law, and not to question the benefit of the right to housing or to diminish its level of protection or guarantee. In this respect, the right to housing cannot be reduced to a simple function of limiting other rights, the right to property, freedom of enterprise, free competition, to name but a few. The right to housing has its own positive obligations. It carries intrinsic obligations on protection, and it is a goal in itself. It is therefore necessary to re-evaluate the status of the right to housing. We can do without property, but we cannot do without a personal home. The question of the effectiveness of the right to housing is not one of limits, but rather of the distribution of the burden of this collective responsibility so that it is effective. On this point, the European consensus is being built and is even likely to produce binding positive law, as shown by the European Pillar of Social Rights, Principle 19 of which is devoted to housing and assistance to homeless people, which has led to the setting up the platform to fight homelessness with the objective of ending it by 2030. And a European Parliament resolution on access to decent and affordable housing for all adopted in 2021, the ongoing directive on energy efficiency in building, and more generally the Fit for 55 package. The proposed revision of the electricity market, about which the European Commission is in favor of banning energy cuts, and the proposed control of tourist rental in the draft regulation of digital platforms. And it was during the proportionality review of a national law, French in this case, which regulates the exercise of tourist rental, that the Court of Justice of European Union ruled in 2020 in the Cali ruling that fighting the shortage of housing is a cause of imperative general interest. And this cause justifies the intervention in public authorities to regulate the rental market, insofar as housing is a basic necessity. In previous cases, requirements relating to social housing policy and the fight against land pressure have also been recognized as compelling reason of public interest. Making the cost of housing affordable therefore justify framing and directing private economic and financial actors much more towards satisfying the housing needs of all and produce social housing. We cannot ignore the German, Swiss, and Austrian choices in terms of rent control, or the Dutch or French choices in terms of social housing production, and watch models that have proved their worth reach a point in exhaustion and collapse when opposed to markets that monopolize the sector and make these models increasingly powerless to guarantee housing to their population. So, states must be encouraged to review their legislation and policies in the light of the positive obligation imposed by the right to housing, to draw the consequences of the obligation to act that arise from it. And the European Union at its place here. Finally, we must not hesitate to assert the right to housing without presuming its weakness, and to oppose it individually and collectively to abuse of all kinds, even if they are legitimized by political trends or ideologies. The right to housing does not give rise to many disputes, and the first lesson of our publication is that the little that has been done so far has produced right and protection. So it is a path to be invested in with strength, as it seems necessary for us to maintain the gains obtained and to reinforce the right to housing. Thank you.
Thank you, Noria. That was really good. Thank you so much. I don't have any more to say. Just to say to our audience that the book is already published online, both in English and in French, in the Housing Rights Watch website. I have pasted the 2 links in the webinar chat, so you'll have to go and read it, and you will see that you have the whole book that you can download, but you can also download by chapter. So if there are some topics that are more interesting to you than others, then you can go directly to the chapter that interests you more. Okay, and we hope that this will not be the last publication that we do together. We try to produce tools and readings that are interesting for the overall NGO sector, but also sometimes beyond the NGO sector. So thank you everyone for participating today. I hope that this was interesting for you, and don't hesitate to contact us if you need any support with housing rights issues. Thank you very much for attending. See you soon. Bye.